3 years ago, when I bought my house on Willow Creek Lane, I thought the best thing I was getting was peace and quiet. Turns out, the real luxury wasn't the house, the oversized garage, or even the fact that the mortgage was somehow lower than my old apartment rent. It was the view. My backyard happened to be the only lot on the entire street with a completely unobstructed sight line to a small lake tucked behind the neighborhood greenbelt. Every morning I'd sit outside with a cup of coffee and watch the sunlight hit the water. It wasn't a private lake. Anybody could walk around it. But from my property, it looked like a postcard. The guy next door, however, seemed to think that postcard belonged to him. His name was Brent. At least that's what I'll call him. Brent was one of those neighbors who never officially crossed a line, but somehow always managed to stand directly on top of it. The first week I moved in, he wandered into my backyard without asking, just to check out the view. The second week he suggested I trim several trees because they partially blocked his angle from his patio. The third week, he casually mentioned that it was kind of selfish for one homeowner to have the best view in the neighborhood. I laughed because I assumed he was joking. Looking back, I don't think he was. About 6 months after moving in, I hired a contractor to build a 6-foot cedar privacy fence along our shared property line. Not because of Brent, at least not entirely. I simply liked privacy. The survey markers were verified, permits were filed, everything was done correctly. The fence sat completely on my property. Brent hated it immediately. He complained that it ruined the open feeling between our yards. He complained that it blocked breezes. He complained that it wasn't neighborly. What he never directly admitted was that it blocked his ability to stare through my backyard at the lake. For almost 2 years, things stayed relatively calm. Then one Saturday afternoon, I stepped outside carrying a bag of charcoal for my grill and stopped dead in my tracks. One section of my fence wasn't closed anymore. It had been unlatched, folded backward, and propped open with a landscaping brick. For a second I honestly thought somebody had broken in. Then I noticed the 2 patio chairs. They were positioned on Brent's side of the property line, perfectly aligned with the opening. Both chairs faced directly toward the lake. Next to them sat a small table with 2 drinks. Attached to one of my fence posts with plastic zip ties was a Bluetooth speaker playing classic rock. I just stood there staring, trying to process what I was looking at. The longer I looked, the more ridiculous it became. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't wind damage. This wasn't a loose latch. Somebody had intentionally opened my fence and created a viewing window through my property. Right on cue, Brent stepped outside holding a beer. He looked at me, looked at the opening, and smiled like everything was completely normal. I said, "Why is my fence open?" He shrugged. Actually shrugged. Then he said, "We were just enjoying the lake." I asked why my fence had been modified. He took a sip of his beer and said, "Come on, man, relax. We're just borrowing the view. It's not like you own the water." I remember standing there thinking that I had just encountered a level of entitlement so impressive it almost deserved an award. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I walked over, removed the brick, folded the fence panel shut, secured the latch, cut the speaker loose, and handed it back to him. Then I simply said, "Don't touch my fence again." His smile disappeared. Not because he felt guilty, but because he looked genuinely annoyed that I wasn't cooperating. I went inside figuring the message had been delivered. Apparently it had not. The following weekend I heard voices outside around sunset. Lots of voices. When I walked into my backyard, I found something that somehow managed to be even more unbelievable than the first incident. Brent was hosting a dinner party. There were 7 or 8 guests sitting in folding chairs lined up beside the same section of fence. The panel had been opened again. String lights were threaded through my fence posts. Extension cords crossed the property line. The entire setup looked like some kind of outdoor theater aimed directly at the lake beyond my yard. One woman actually waved at me while holding a wine glass. Another guest turned and said, "You have such an amazing view back here." That's when it finally clicked. Brent hadn't misunderstood property boundaries. He understood them perfectly. He just didn't care. In his mind, because he wanted something, he had already justified taking it. And standing there watching a group of strangers use my fence like a community-owned observation deck, I realized this situation was about to become a whole lot bigger than a lake view. Now before I get back to the story, let me explain something, because this is where a lot of neighborhood disputes go sideways. People often assume that if something feels harmless, it must also be legal. That's not how it works. According to standard procedure, Property boundaries exist for a reason. It doesn't matter whether you're borrowing a ladder, trimming a tree branch, or opening someone else's fence because you want a better view. Permission is what separates neighborly behavior from trespassing. From a legal perspective, Brent wasn't taking the lake view. He was interfering with a structure that sat entirely on another homeowner's property. That's a very different issue. But honestly, the legal side wasn't even the most interesting part. The psychology was. This is a psychological trap that shows up all the time. Once someone gets away with a small violation, they start treating it like a right instead of a privilege. The first time they cross the line, they test your reaction. The second time, they assume the line no longer exists. And judging by the dinner party happening next door, Brent had already convinced himself that my fence was basically community property. What he didn't realize was that he had just handed me all the evidence I would ever need. The next morning, I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and started organizing photographs. Every picture I had taken the previous evening went into a folder. The open fence panel, the extension cords, the string lights attached to my fence posts, the chairs lined up in formation facing the lake, the guests, the speaker, everything. The funny thing was that Brent had spent months acting like I was the unreasonable one. But people who believe rules don't apply to them usually make one critical mistake: they become careless. They stop hiding what they're doing because they convince themselves they're justified. That dinner party wasn't just annoying. It was documentation. By lunchtime, I had uploaded everything into the HOA portal and filed a formal complaint. Then I attached a copy of my original survey from when the fence had been installed. After that, I figured I'd wait a week or two for bureaucracy to do what bureaucracy does. Instead, I received a response less than 48 hours later. Apparently, the property manager had reviewed the survey, compared it against neighborhood records, and determined something very simple. The fence was mine. Entirely mine. Not partially shared. Not sitting on a boundary line. Not subject to any access easement. Mine. The HOA representative actually called me personally and asked a few clarifying questions. When I described the fence being repeatedly opened and modified, there was a long pause on the phone. Finally, she said, "He's doing what?" That was the moment I realized I wasn't overreacting. Sometimes when you're stuck inside a conflict for months, you start questioning your own judgment. You wonder if maybe you're being too sensitive. Then you explain the situation to a neutral third party, and they respond with complete disbelief. That's usually a pretty good sign you're not the problem. 3 days later, Brent received an official violation notice. I know because I happened to be outside when the certified mail arrived. He walked down his driveway, signed for the envelope, opened it immediately, and I could practically see the confusion forming on his face from 40 yards away. That evening he knocked on my door. The first thing he said wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a greeting. It was, "Did you seriously report me?" I said yes. He stared at me like I had committed some kind of betrayal. Then came the excuses. He claimed everybody in the neighborhood enjoyed the lake. He claimed I was creating unnecessary tension. He claimed the HOA was overreacting. Then he delivered my personal favorite. "Nobody owns a view." I remember laughing because for once we actually agreed. "You're right," I said. "Nobody owns a view. But I do own my fence." He didn't have much of a response to that. The HOA notice required him to remove everything attached to the structure and pay a fine within 14 days. It also required written acknowledgement that the fence belonged exclusively to me. The look on his face when he realized he couldn't argue his way out of it was worth every second of frustration I'd experienced. But here's the thing. Even after receiving the violation notice, I still knew the underlying problem wasn't solved. Brent hadn't suddenly developed respect for property rights. He'd simply been forced to comply. The resentment was still there. The envy was still there. The obsession with the lake view was definitely still there. And that's when I decided to solve the actual problem instead of the symptom. A week later, I met with a landscaping contractor named Marcus. I walked him along the property line and explained the situation. Halfway through my explanation, he started smiling. By the end, he was openly laughing. "So let me get this straight," he said. "Your neighbor keeps opening your fence because he wants to see the lake. That's the short version. And what exactly do you want to do about it?" I looked at the fence. Then I looked toward Brent's patio chairs. Then I said, "I want to make sure he never sees it through my yard again." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I can help." Over the next few days, we developed a plan. Technically, I could have simply reinforced the fence, added locks, installed cameras, increased security. But that would only address access. I wanted to eliminate the incentive. So we designed something much bigger. The project involved a 12-foot privacy screen extending along the entire shared boundary. Heavy-duty steel posts, deep concrete footings, commercial-grade materials, perfectly compliant with local regulations and HOA guidelines. Completely legal, completely permanent. Then came the second layer, a dense row of green giant arborvitae planted on my side of the property line. Each tree stood roughly 6 feet tall on installation day. According to the contractor, they would grow rapidly and eventually create a towering natural wall of greenery. When construction began, Brent finally realized something was happening. The first truck arrived on a Tuesday morning. By noon, equipment was everywhere. Workers were measuring, digging, and setting posts. Around lunchtime, Brent came marching across his yard. "What's all this?" he demanded. Marcus looked at me. I looked at Marcus. Then I answered, "Landscaping." Technically, that was true. Brent stared at the steel posts being lowered into holes. "That seems excessive." I almost reminded him that cutting viewing windows into somebody else's fence was also excessive, but I didn't bother. There was no point. The project continued for the rest of the week. Every day, another section went up. Every day, the lake became a little less visible from his side. Every day, Brent looked a little more irritated. By Friday afternoon, the transformation was impossible to ignore. What had once been an open sight line was now interrupted by a massive privacy barrier backed by rows of young, evergreen trees. The truly beautiful part wasn't the screen itself. It was the future. Those arborvitae weren't staying 6 feet tall. They were going to grow, and keep growing. Nature was essentially becoming my long-term security system. A few days later, the HOA deadline arrived. Brent had no choice but to comply. I watched from my kitchen window as he removed every last string light from the fence. He cut zip ties, rolled up extension cords, detached hardware. At one point, he stood there holding the Bluetooth speaker that had started this entire mess. The irony was almost poetic. For months, he had acted like my property existed for his convenience. Now he was being forced to clean up the evidence himself. The written acknowledgement was submitted. The fine was paid. The violation was closed. Officially, the dispute was over. But the real ending happened several months later. One evening, I walked outside with a cup of coffee and glanced toward the property line. The arborvitae had already gained noticeable height. The privacy screen blended into the greenery so naturally that it looked like it had always been there. On the other side sat Brent's patio furniture. The same chairs, the same table, the same arrangement. They were still pointed toward where the lake used to be visible. Except now there was nothing to see. Just a solid wall of green. It was one of the most unintentionally funny things I've ever witnessed. The chairs remained. The view was gone. And for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, the conflict was completely finished. Not because somebody won an argument. Not because somebody changed their personality. But because the opportunity to repeat the behavior had disappeared. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with dramatic speeches or courtroom victories. Sometimes justice looks like a man sitting on a patio, staring at 12 feet of privacy screening and a future forest he helped inspire. Looking back now, the funny thing is that the lake was never really the issue. If you asked Brent today, he'd probably still say this whole thing happened because of a view. But from where I sit, the view was just the excuse. The real conflict was about boundaries, physical boundaries, legal boundaries, and maybe most importantly, personal boundaries. Most neighborhood disputes don't start with somebody waking up one morning and deciding to become the villain. They usually begin with a small act of entitlement that goes unchallenged. Somebody parks slightly over a property line. Somebody stores equipment on a neighbor's land temporarily. Somebody decides that a rule shouldn't apply to them because their situation feels different. Then, little by little, that behavior grows. The lesson here is that people often mistake tolerance for permission. I think that's exactly what happened in my case. The first time Brent opened the fence, I handled it politely because I genuinely believed we could resolve it like adults. Unfortunately, he interpreted patience as weakness. He interpreted courtesy as consent. And once that happened, every future interaction became harder. That's why I always tell people that healthy boundaries are actually one of the most neighborly things you can have. Clear expectations prevent resentment. They prevent misunderstandings. They prevent situations from escalating into ridiculous stories that eventually end up on the internet. From a legal perspective, None of this was particularly complicated. The survey existed. The property line existed. The HOA rules existed. The problem wasn't a lack of regulations. The problem was a lack of respect for them. That's an important distinction because people often assume rules create conflict, when in reality good rules usually prevent conflict. According to standard procedure, property rights are designed to eliminate ambiguity. Everybody knows where they stand. Everybody knows what belongs to whom. The trouble starts when someone decides those rules are optional. And honestly, that's where the psychological side becomes fascinating. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere, not just in neighborhoods. Once people convince themselves they're morally justified, they become surprisingly comfortable ignoring boundaries. They stop asking whether they have the right to do something and start asking whether they can get away with it. That's a dangerous shift because it turns preference into entitlement. Brent wanted the view, so eventually he convinced himself he deserved access to it. And once a person reaches that conclusion, logic becomes almost useless. You can't negotiate someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. What finally solved the problem wasn't a better argument. It was removing the opportunity altogether. That's a lesson I think applies far beyond HOA communities. Sometimes the smartest solution isn't winning the debate. Sometimes it's redesigning the situation so the debate no longer matters. The privacy screen didn't change Brent's personality. The arborvitae didn't teach him respect. What they did was create a reality where my boundaries were no longer dependent on his cooperation. And that made all the difference. Today, whenever I sit outside with my coffee and look across the backyard, I still see the lake. The sunrise still reflects off the water. The breeze still moves through the trees. The only thing that's changed is that I enjoy it without wondering whether somebody is about to turn my fence into a community viewing platform. And if there's one final takeaway from this entire experience, it's this: protecting your property doesn't make you selfish. Protecting your peace doesn't make you unreasonable. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for yourself and for everyone around you is calmly enforce a boundary before somebody else decides it no longer exists. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, how long would you have waited before building the privacy screen? Would you have called the HOA after the first incident, after the dinner party, or would you have handled it differently altogether? Let me know in the comments because I have a feeling this story is going to divide people right down the middle.